Victor Hayes sat in his office, staring at the latest complaints from his trucking company's drivers. Delayed deliveries, burnout, and poor management. It didn't make sense. He had built this company from the ground up, starting as a driver himself before expanding to 13 distribution centers across the state. He treated his employees well, or at least he thought he did. But the reports told a different story. Drivers were being pushed past their limits, working overtime without proper breaks. Some even mentioned being berated by management for not moving fast enough. That wasn't how he had run things when he was behind the wheel. Frustrated with the lack of clear answers from his managers, Victor made a decision. He wasn't going to sit in an office and rely on second-hand reports. He was going undercover. Victor hadn't personally met many of the newer employees. His company had grown too fast for that, and the managers handled most of the hiring. He could use that to his advantage. Slipping into the role of a new driver wouldn't be hard. He still had his commercial license and knew the routes like the back of his hand. He just needed a new identity. A few days later, Vince Hartman walked into the company's largest distribution center. With a slightly graying beard, a trucker's cap, and worn-out jeans, he looked like any other middle-aged man trying to make a living. His application had gone through without a hitch. No one had questioned it. The company was short-staffed, which made it easy for a new hire to slip in without much scrutiny. The first morning was rough. The warehouse was chaotic. Drivers were scrambling to load their trucks, some running on just a few hours of sleep. The break rooms smelled like burnt coffee and exhaustion. Victor noticed a man slumped against a chair, rubbing his temples. "You good?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. The man looked up. His name tag read Derek. His eyes were bloodshot. "Been driving since 4 a.m. Dispatch messed up my schedule again. Barely got home before they called me back in." Victor frowned. "They didn't give you a break?" Derek let out a humorless chuckle. "Breaks? If you stop too long, management starts breathing down your neck. And if you don't hit your delivery times, they'll dock your hours next week." Victor clenched his jaw. That wasn't how his company was supposed to run. Before he could ask more, a voice cut through the room. "Derek, quit sitting around. I don't care how tired you are, you've got another run." Victor turned. A man in a crisp button-up shirt stood in the doorway. He wasn't dressed like the other workers, no dirt on his hands, no exhaustion in his eyes. "Who's that?" Victor asked quietly. Derek sighed. "That's Brad, one of the managers. He doesn't drive, doesn't load. Just yells." Victor watched as Brad stomped over. "You're late already, Derek. Get moving." Derek stood, wobbling slightly. "Boss, I've been running since before sunrise. Can I at least grab a coffee?" Brad scoffed. "You need coffee? Maybe you should learn how to manage your time better. You drivers are always making excuses." Victor's hands curled into fists. He forced himself to stay quiet. He needed to see more before stepping in. Derek didn't argue. He just sighed and grabbed his keys, trudging toward his truck. Victor turned to Brad. "Hey, I'm new. Name's Vince. That guy okay?" Brad barely looked at him. "He'll be fine. You new guys always come in soft. You'll learn fast this isn't a job for complainers." Victor bit back his anger. "Got it." Brad clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. Now quit standing around. You've got a delivery in 30 minutes. Victor nodded, but inside, his blood was boiling. If this was how Brad treated drivers, he had no business being in charge. Victor climbed into his truck, gripping the wheel tight. He wasn't just here to observe anymore. He was here to fix this. Victor adjusted his seat, feeling the familiar weight of the steering wheel in his hands. It had been years since he'd last done a delivery run himself, but muscle memory kicked in as he navigated the truck out of the lot. His route took him across the city to a series of warehouses and retail stores, standard deliveries that should have been straightforward. But things weren't running smoothly. His first stop was behind schedule before he even arrived. The manifest listed 8 pallets, but the loaders had only given him 6. When he called dispatch for clarification, he was met with indifference. A woman on the other end of the line, her voice tired and strained, told him to just deliver what you have and move on. That wasn't how things used to work. Mistakes like these led to lost business, frustrated customers, and backtracking that wasted fuel and time. Victor made a note. He wanted to check the warehouse operations later. At his second stop, he ran into a driver he hadn't met before. The man, a wiry figure with an old baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, was struggling to push a heavy pallet onto his lift gate. Victor jumped down to help. Together, they got the load secured. The man wiped his forehead and sighed. Appreciate it. Been running back-to-back routes all week. Feels like there's no breathing room anymore. Victor asked if things had always been this hectic. The man shook his head. Used to be better. But lately, they've been cutting corners, pushing more runs per shift. Management's got this idea that if we're not moving, we're wasting time. Doesn't matter if we're exhausted or if deliveries are messed up. Just keep rolling. Victor was starting to see the pattern. Overworked drivers, a disorganized warehouse, and a management team that saw employees as numbers instead of people. He kept his head down and finished his route, but every mistake, every delay, every frustrated worker added to the growing list of problems. By the time he pulled back into the lot, the sun was dipping low in the sky. Drivers were checking in, some slumping into the break room, others heading straight for their cars, too drained to socialize. Victor walked toward the office, intending to observe the dispatch team. As he approached, he heard raised voices. Inside, Brad was leaning over a desk, speaking sharply to a woman in a headset. She looked defensive, her shoulders tense. How hard is it to keep track of a simple schedule? Brad snapped. We've had 3 missed deliveries this week. That makes us look incompetent. The woman, who Victor now recognized as the same dispatcher he'd spoken to earlier, took a breath before replying. We're short on drivers. You keep adding extra stops to their routes, and they can't keep up. I told you we needed to hire more people. Brad scoffed. Hiring costs money. We don't need more drivers. We need the ones we have to step up. Victor had heard enough. He stepped inside, acting like he was just another driver checking in. The woman glanced at him, her face tight with frustration, before turning back to her screen. Brad noticed him and crossed his arms. What do you need? Victor remained calm. Just checking in after my route. Had a couple of issues. Wrong pallet count on my first stop, and dispatch told me to just deliver what I had. Brad waved a hand dismissively. That happens. Just move on. Victor didn't let it drop. That kind of mistake costs money. If customers don't get their full order, they'll start looking elsewhere. Brad gave a dry chuckle. You're new, so let me explain how it works here. We don't have time to babysit every load. If a mistake happens, tough. Drivers aren't paid to ask questions, just to drive. The way he said it made something in Victor's gut tighten. He masked his irritation, giving a slow nod like he was considering the words. So, we're just supposed to ignore problems? Brad shrugged. Unless you plan on running the company, yeah. That's how it works. Victor held back a reply. His time to speak would come soon. He turned to leave, but not before catching the dispatcher's eye. There was something behind her expression, a quiet understanding, like she knew he wasn't just another driver. Victor walked back to his truck, his mind turning. Tomorrow he was going to push harder. He needed to see just how deep this problem ran. Because if Brad thought this was how things worked, he had another thing coming. Victor arrived early the next day, blending in with the other drivers gathering near the loading docks. The air was thick with fatigue, the kind that settled into a person's bones after too many long shifts without proper rest. A few men leaned against their trucks, sipping from gas station coffee cups, while others checked their manifests, their faces tight with frustration. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he listened. Conversations swirled around him, gripes about dispatch errors, complaints about maintenance issues being ignored, quiet muttering about how management kept pushing for more deliveries without adding more staff. The tension was palpable, but it was the kind of frustration that had become routine, something these drivers had clearly learned to live with. Victor wasn't willing to accept that. His own manifest had him scheduled for an unreasonable number of stops, far more than what should have been assigned to a single driver in one shift. The unrealistic expectations weren't just a fluke, they were deliberate. He folded the paper and tucked it into his jacket before making his way toward the warehouse. He needed to see how things were running behind the scenes. Inside, forklifts beeped as they maneuvered between stacks of pallets. Workers moved fast, but with a kind of resigned efficiency, their motions mechanical. No one looked like they were cutting corners, but it was clear they were stretched thin. Victor spotted a younger worker struggling to shift a heavy pallet onto a loading dock, sweat glistening on his forehead. He stepped in, gripping the edge of the pallet and helping ease it into place. The worker exhaled sharply, nodding in thanks. He muttered that they were short on loaders again, said that 2 guys had quit last week because they couldn't keep up with the pace. Victor asked if management had done anything about it. The worker gave a humorless laugh before saying that Brad's response had been to tell them to work smarter. Victor felt his jaw tighten. He left the warehouse and headed back toward his truck, only to see Brad standing near the dispatch office, barking orders at a driver who was clearly already on edge. The man was rubbing his temples, his expression tight with exhaustion as Brad scolded him for missing a delivery window the day before. Victor stepped closer, listening. Brad told the driver that excuses wouldn't cut it, that if he couldn't handle the workload, there were plenty of other guys who would take his spot. The driver looked like he wanted to argue, but he just nodded, shoulders slumping as he turned away. Victor had heard enough. He walked straight up to Brad, keeping his expression neutral. He said he had a question about his manifest. Brad barely glanced at him before saying that if he had an issue, he could take it up with dispatch. Victor didn't move. Instead, he asked how management expected drivers to complete routes that weren't physically possible without skipping necessary breaks. Brad scoffed, saying that the best drivers figured out how to make it work. Victor pressed further, asking if Brad had ever actually driven a route himself. Brad's expression flickered for a moment before he said that wasn't his job. Victor nodded slowly, then asked if Brad thought threatening tired employees was an effective management strategy. Brad's posture stiffened. He asked what Victor's problem was, why he was so concerned with things that didn't involve him. Victor exhaled, then let his voice drop into something quieter, something firm. He said it involved him more than Brad realized. Then, with measured purpose, he reached up and pulled his cap off. For a moment, there was silence. Then recognition dawned in Brad's eyes. His face paled. Victor had seen enough. He told Brad they needed to have a conversation right now. Brad stammered, saying he hadn't realized, saying that if there were issues, they could handle them internally. Victor didn't let him finish. He told Brad that the way he treated employees wasn't just unprofessional, it was unacceptable. He said that no one in a leadership position should ever think of their workers as disposable, that the company had been built on respect, and Brad had completely abandoned that principle. The other drivers had noticed by now. A few had stopped what they were doing, watching the exchange unfold. Victor didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He said that effective leadership wasn't about barking orders from the sidelines, it was about understanding the people who kept the business running. And Brad had failed at that completely. Brad started to say that he was just trying to keep things efficient, but Victor cut him off. Efficient didn't mean grinding employees into the ground. It didn't mean ignoring safety or pushing people past their limits. And it certainly didn't mean treating workers like they were replaceable. Brad had nothing to say to that. Victor turned to the gathered employees. He apologized to the drivers, to the warehouse workers, to the dispatchers who had been put in impossible situations. He promised change. Brad wouldn't be part of that change. Victor made that clear. Effective immediately, Brad was out. The tension in the air shifted. Some of the drivers exchanged glances, as if waiting for the punchline. But when they saw Victor's face, they knew this wasn't for show. Victor looked at the dispatcher he'd overheard the day before. He told her she was in charge now, at least until they found someone permanent. She looked stunned but nodded. Then he turned back to the employees. He said things would be different, that real changes were coming, not just words, but action. Better scheduling. More hires. A management team that actually listened. For the first time since he'd walked into that distribution center, Victor saw something shift in their faces. Hope. He had come undercover to find the truth. And now he was going to fix it. The distribution center was quieter now, the usual hum of activity subdued after Victor's confrontation with Brad. Drivers lingered near their trucks, still processing what had just happened. The air felt different, not tense, but uncertain. The sudden removal of a manager wasn't something that happened often, and certainly not with the company's owner standing in the middle of the lot. Victor took a slow breath. Dismantling bad leadership was only the first step. Now came the real work. He turned to the dispatcher, the one who had been arguing with Brad the day before. She was still standing near the office, her hands curled into fists, as if bracing for another argument that wasn't coming. He told her they needed to go inside and talk. She hesitated, then nodded, leading the way into the small dispatch room. Inside, the air was stuffy, filled with the faint scent of stale coffee and lingering frustration. Papers were stacked haphazardly on desks, some with handwritten notes scribbled in the margins. A monitor near the back displayed a map of active routes, a tangled web of lines stretching across the state. Victor gestured for her to sit. She did, her fingers tapping against the desk, a nervous energy still clinging to her. He asked how bad things really were. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, with a quiet exhale, she admitted that the company had been running on fumes for months. Drivers were quitting faster than they could be replaced. The routes were overloaded because there simply weren't enough people to cover them. Mistakes in scheduling weren't accidents, they were inevitable when one dispatcher was handling the workload of 3. Victor absorbed the information. He had seen it firsthand, but hearing it laid out like this made it even clearer. This wasn't just a problem with Brad, this was structural. He asked why no one had escalated these issues before. She let out a dry laugh. Because Brad made sure it never went anywhere. Complaints got buried, turnover was treated as unavoidable, and anyone who pushed too hard was labeled as difficult. Victor leaned back, rubbing his jaw. He had built this company with the belief that leadership should support its people, not break them. Somehow, that vision had been lost along the way. He told her that things were going to change starting now. They needed immediate fixes. More drivers had to be hired, and not just to replace the ones who had left. They needed enough people to make sure no one was running themselves into the ground. Dispatch couldn't be a one-person operation anymore. More staff would be brought in to balance the workload. She listened, her expression shifting from skepticism to something closer to relief. Victor wasn't done. He asked how the drivers would react to a meeting at the end of the shift. He wanted them to hear directly from him. She said they'd probably be cautious. They had been promised change before. He said they'd see the difference soon. The meeting was set. As the afternoon stretched on, Victor spent his time where he was needed most. He walked the warehouse floor, talking to workers who had spent too long being ignored. He helped load a few trucks himself, listening as employees shared their frustrations. Some were hesitant, unsure if they could trust that things would actually improve. Others were more open, relieved that someone was finally paying attention. The drivers returned from their routes as the sun dipped lower. Some looked exhausted, others resigned, expecting another routine check-in before they could finally go home. Instead, they found Victor waiting for them. He stood near the loading dock, where the afternoon light cast long shadows across the pavement. The employees gathered slowly, some exchanging glances, still unsure of what to expect. Victor didn't waste time. He told them what he had seen. The long hours, the impossible schedules, the way management had treated them like machines instead of people. He admitted that he had been disconnected, that he had trusted the wrong leadership to oversee operations. That changed today. He laid out the plan. More drivers, better scheduling, management that actually listened. No more threats, no more pushing people to their limits without support. There was silence for a moment. Then, from the back, one of the older drivers asked if this was just another speech. Victor looked him in the eye and said no. Actions would follow. The dispatcher stepped forward, confirming that changes were already being put in motion. The hiring process had started, new policies were being drafted, and from now on, concerns wouldn't be ignored. The skepticism in the air didn't vanish completely, but something shifted. One of the younger drivers, the one Victor had helped with a pallet earlier, nodded.
He said it was about time.
A few others murmured agreement. It wasn't a celebration, but it was a start. As the crowd dispersed, Victor stayed behind, watching as the employees left for the night. He knew this wasn't something that could be fixed in a single day. Trust had to be rebuilt, and that would take time. But he had seen the worst of it now, and he wouldn't let it happen again. The next morning, Victor arrived at the distribution center before the first trucks rolled out. The air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of diesel engines warming up in the lot. He stood near the loading docks, watching as employees filtered in, some rubbing sleep from their eyes, others already settling into their routines. He had spent most of the night reviewing company reports, digging into driver turnover data, maintenance logs, and profit margins. The numbers painted an undeniable picture of overextension and neglect. The business had been running at full throttle without considering the long-term cost. That was changing today. A few drivers noticed him standing there, nodding in acknowledgement, but keeping their distance. The skepticism was still there, but it was mixed with curiosity now. Word had spread fast about Brad's firing. Some were waiting to see if it was just a symbolic move, or if things would actually improve. Victor made his way to the dispatch office, where the new interim lead was already at her desk, scanning the morning routes. She barely glanced up before handing him a stack of papers, a detailed breakdown of how the day's deliveries were structured. He flipped through them, noting adjustments had already been made. Routes were more balanced, and break times were properly scheduled. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. She didn't wait for him to ask before explaining that some of the drivers had voiced concerns about certain warehouse locations being understaffed, leading to delays. She had already started compiling a list of the worst offenders so they could address it. Victor nodded in approval. This was the kind of management the company needed, proactive, not reactive. He left the office and walked toward the maintenance garage, where a few mechanics were working under the hood of a truck. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with grease-streaked hands, looked up as Victor approached. His expression was unreadable at first, but then he leaned against a tooled chest and crossed his arms. There was no hesitation when he spoke. He told Victor that the fleet had been running harder than it should have been, with some trucks overdue for servicing because there hadn't been enough downtime to get them in for repairs. Some of the older rigs were barely hanging on, patched together with quick fixes instead of proper maintenance. Victor didn't interrupt. He let the man talk, listening closely. The mechanics had been raising concerns for months, but Brad had ignored them, pushing the trucks to stay on the road as long as possible instead of rotating them out for servicing. The result was a growing list of safety issues that could have been avoided. Victor asked for a full report on every vehicle that needed immediate attention. He made it clear that from now on, no truck would be sent out unless it was in proper working condition. The mechanic nodded, his face unreadable, but there was something in the way he carried himself that suggested relief. Back in the yard, drivers were preparing to head out. Victor spotted Derek near his truck, adjusting the straps on a pallet. The exhaustion from the previous days was still there, but there was a shift in his demeanor, not quite trust, but something close to cautious optimism. Victor walked over, standing beside him as he double-checked the load. Derek didn't say anything at first, just focused on his work. Then, without looking up, he said that mornings felt different now. Victor asked him what he meant. Derek tightened a strap before answering. He said that before, showing up to work had felt like stepping into a fight, every day one where the drivers always lost. But today, people seemed to be waiting, watching, wondering if the promises would hold. Victor didn't offer empty reassurances. He simply told Derek to keep an eye on things and speak up if anything still felt off. Derek gave a slow nod before climbing into his truck. As the morning rush settled and the trucks rolled out, Victor returned to the office. He had a meeting scheduled with the regional operations team people who had been overseeing multiple centers but had clearly failed to notice what had been happening on the ground. The conference room was small, with outdated chairs and a table covered in stacks of reports. The team sat stiffly as Victor entered, their faces carefully neutral. They had heard about Brad, and now they were waiting to see how far the changes would go. Victor didn't waste time. He laid out everything he had seen firsthand: the overworked drivers, the ignored maintenance issues, the toxic management style that had gone unchecked. He asked how none of it had been caught earlier. One of the senior managers, a woman whose expression was unreadable, admitted that Brad had been reporting strong efficiency numbers. On paper, everything had looked fine. Victor asked if anyone had bothered to talk to the employees directly. Silence followed. He told them that from now on, efficiency wouldn't be measured in how much they could squeeze out of their workforce, but in how well they supported the people keeping the company running. That meant more site visits, direct engagement with drivers, and a clear chain of accountability. One of the other managers, a younger man who had been quiet until now, spoke up. He said that if they implemented these changes, it would slow down operations at first. Victor agreed. It would take time to adjust, but the long-term benefits far outweighed the short-term disruption. By the time the meeting ended, the tone in the room had shifted. The managers weren't completely convinced yet, but they understood that this wasn't just a temporary shake-up. Victor wasn't backing down. Outside, the yard was quieter now, with most of the trucks out on their routes. Victor stood near the loading docks, watching as a forklift operator moved a fresh pallet onto a truck bed. The rhythm of the place was changing, not overnight, not instantly, but in a way that was real. As he turned to head back inside, he caught sight of the dispatcher watching him from the office window. Their eyes met for a moment before she gave a small nod, as if acknowledging that, for the first time in a long while, things were moving in the right direction. Victor knew there was still a long road ahead. Trust had to be rebuilt, systems had to be refined, and the culture of the company needed to shift for good. But today was a start, a real one, and that was enough to keep pushing forward.